it is the models or the oversimplification of things comes from a desire to familiarize students with concepts that are too complex and too large in real life, no? And I don't think it's particularly limited to social science. We also see this in mathematics and biology and physics too, don't we? And the second point is that as far as the whole why did the economists not see so many big crises or events coming up towards us is the fact that it's also seen in medical sciences and natural sciences. So I don't know why this has been so focused only when it comes to economics.
You mean lack of predictive power?
Yeah.
I think, first of all, many social sciences don't claim any predictive power. What they certainly no precise predictive power. Economics tends to claim precise predictive power in many areas. A lot of social sciences don't. They may claim to discern patterns, trends, which certainly are not universally universal. They may be quite time limited. They may be quite local. But economics actually makes larger claims, and it's those. I wouldn't mind those sort of claims, but the larger claims, I think, do deserve critical scrutiny. As for the point of models, of course, every discipline needs models. It's no good to have a map that is simply a reproduction of the terrain. You obviously simplify in order to isolate the salient points of interest. You then have the problem there is it's not that you have to simplify. We accept we have to simplify, but it's how you simplify and what you select for the simplification that is crucial. Again, one's going to deal with this in the philosophy of science, how you set up your model, what assumptions you feed into it, what variables you think are relevant to the deductions you want to make, and then beyond that, how that relates to the real world, for how you might try and think about testing your conclusions. Now, the thing is, that's where the difficulty lies. It's not in the modeling itself, and certainly mathematics is perfectly good for establishing the logic of a particular train of thought. No problem there. It's the claim that the mathematics actually proves something other than the mathematics. It's that link with the real world that I think is the difficulty.
So I think that answers the question I was about to ask, which is how useful do you think game theory is to economics?
I look upon it as an attempt to break out of the cage of solipsism into something interactive. With games like the Prisoner's Dilemma and the idea of repeated games, you are actually getting to explain how people come to cooperate with each other, which every sociologist would know, and every historian would know, every psychologist would know, without having to trace it by the steps that economists think essential to establish it. So whether they add value to the understanding of cooperation, let's say, I'm not convinced by. Maybe they're just using up a lot of time in order to convince themselves by their own methods, because they don't actually believe in anything anyone else says. I don't know. I often feel that economists discover with great surprise things that everyone else has known about for thousands of years. They go, wow, really? Yeah.
I was interested in your question of whether economies would grow just as much if there was no economics, and actually questioning the practical value of economics for helping economic growth. And I think it's an interesting one because a lot of what you study in economics is studying things like, in microeconomics, studying things like individuals' utility functions and the profit maximization of firms. And you do all this very mathematically, and you can apply your Lagrange multiplier and so forth. But at the end of the day, lots of firms who make lots of money and help economic growth have never studied economics, and they wouldn't be able to plot their profit functions or utility functions on a graph, but they're still very productive in growing the economy. So I think it's an interesting question, and I'm inclined to think that actually a huge amount of economics is just adding a mathematical analysis to something that happens naturally, and it doesn't particularly boost the productivity of the society.
That's a view that many people would share, but then you have to ask the question, I think, why before people started thinking economically, was there so little material progress? At some point, there was some shift. Now, economics was part of it. I don't think it was the whole of it. I mean, it's often been called the Enlightenment, and there was a break in thinking that it was really a death of God problem. Suddenly, human life became the arena of progress and even salvation, and you didn't have to invest in God. You could actually invest in this life. And so the attitude to economic activities shifts, and economics is part of that shift. Now, whether you would have had any material progress without that general shift of which economics is part, I don't know. I think not. I think people have just gone on doing the same as they had been. But then what economics specifically added to the Enlightenment view of the human condition, I'm not convinced. Maybe it helped win the argument against the deists or people who wanted to insist that this was just a preparation, this life, for an afterlife. Maybe economics was part of that arsenal which said, no, this life is important, and and material wealth is important. And then you get into deep questions which also relate and aren't specifically related to economics, which is the idea of the Puritan ethic and the history, the origins of capitalism. It's not connected to economics. Economics only claims, at best, that it intuits certain things about the human conditions and then sets them up as axioms for its simplified models. I mean, it wouldn't say that it invents human behavior. It observes human behavior and then tries to simplify it and get the gist of it so that somehow they can persuade others that that is a good way of doing things, might persuade governments to get rid of tariffs and things like that, something like that. Imagine a perfectly well-intentioned state which has a computer into which is fed all the information about consumer choices, quantities, prices, all the information about the whole economy. Then the achievement of growth then simply becomes a mathematical problem, doesn't it? Why should we need a market?
The way I look at it is that the state doesn't have the processing power.
Is the what?
It doesn't have the processing power
Uh-huh.
to process all that information, but the market does.
Yes, that of course is one of Hayek's arguments, a very important one. Power of computers has increased so much since Hayek's day. Does his argument then fall to the ground?
This computer would need to understand why some parents will buy their children the latest toy and others won't.
Yeah, well, he would need to understand the whole preference set of everyone in the economy, but large data will supply that. There will be a proportion of parents who want to buy this kind of toy and that others want to buy that kind of toy, others, yeah. So feeding in the big data into the computer.
There's still a problem of contingencies. So if you need a computer like that, you'd need a computer that can also predict all the possible outcomes of the future, and any small changes in the inputs could have a butterfly effect.
Yeah.
And so it might not be. It's basically you'd need a computer that can process all the data and predict all the future outcomes, which seems impossible, and that would be basically making us more than human, right?
Yes, but isn't isn't all that implied by the rational expectations hypothesis, which is why it's always struck me that if you're a believer in the hard version of rational expectations, why should you believe in the market? You only believe in the market because there's imperfect information round about. If there was perfect information, the market would be redundant. Isn't that so?
My point also, as for why a computer wouldn't be able to do that, is that that sort of way of viewing people's preferences and choices is that they're set, and you have your set utility function and your rational and so forth. And yet, in actual fact, I think that people change, and they're not as set as that sort of way of viewing things would suppose. For example, on my Facebook feed, I often have adverts which are targeted. And they're based on my previous preferences of things I've clicked on and looked for, predicting what I will want now. But often they're completely wrong because my preferences have changed significantly, and including my deeper preferences, such as between leisure and work, they've shifted. And so I think that's one reason why you wouldn't be able to feed all the perfect information in and then the computer could just process it, because people actually are more fluid than that model of the homo.
Yeah, but then what you're saying is rational expectations is wrong in any hard form. What would a philosopher say about? I mean, what would you say about the computer? Do you think there's a limit to what a computer, a limit to the mimicry of a computer, the limit to which it can mimic actual taste preferences over time, and therefore you need some other mechanism?
So there's a parallel debate going on both in economics and in psychology. The same thing is happening in neuroscience, where people are asking whether you could build a computer that could use all of the data that we know about people's behavior to essentially predict what people will do, but it would need all of the data from essentially what every human brain is going to do. It's logically possible, as I understand it, but practically to have a computer that can process that much data seems impossible.
Well, yes, sorry.
It's not the data processing that is really the problem, because computing has come a long way. Let's just assume computing is not the problem. But given that we're talking about human beings, we always want what we can't have, right? Mm-hmm. And also, you have a group of kids playing in the playground. Today they say, I want the red car, and then someone chooses the blue car, and then you give them the cars they want. You leave them for an hour. I can assure you nobody has the same car they had an hour ago. I think it's just in human nature, isn't it?
Yeah, I would definitely second that, and I would say that our preferences are continually changing in ways that can't be predicted.
Because it's also fed into by our perception of how desirable something is. And
I think in the pure stylistic way you presented that algos can predict behavior, I think you're right, you don't need a market, so I find it a very interesting question. Have you ever asked this question to somebody from Chicago?
I've actually posed it in something I've written about, about the logical, that logically Chicago economics and Soviet central planning are in exactly the same position. The only problem was that the computers that the Soviets had were not powerful enough at the time to do the work the programmers in the Soviet central planning system needed. So there were big mistakes made, and so on and so forth. But anyway, the conceptual world of the two are exactly the same. I mean, if you really do believe that you are modeling interacting robots, and that you have the power to predict exactly how they're going to behave, then you don't need markets. And now I haven't put it to a Chicago economist. The Chicago economist might say, well, we need markets because that puts too much power in the hands of the state. But that's a different argument. It's not an economics argument.
Isn't something strange as well about the way we do economics is that we rely on the market process that should eliminate things that are less efficient and so forth. So when we think about the map and the terrain, we have these models that are the maps. But the strange thing about economics is these maps continually fail. and yet there's no market process for washing out the failing models, right? We double down on neoclassical models that have...
Well, there should be.
Yeah, exactly. And
There should be a market process. If you believe in the Darwinian sifting, you expect the best models to survive and the inferior ones to fall away. But what I'm struck by is this question of persistence. Yeah. Because there's no proper testing mechanism. In natural science, the models that are discarded are, on the whole, the models that produce inferior predictions. But in economics, as in all social sciences, it seems to me, you can't make very successful predictions. You can't test your models in the way through an experimental method or something like else, which is available in natural science. So therefore they go on, and you may say they fail the whole time, but in fact there's no evidence that they fail. The failure could be due to something else.